Hello, good afternoon. Fred Buck wrote this introduction, and I am honored that he asked me to deliver it, so I'm going to start. I met Charles Olson for the first time in September of 1954 at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. He was huge. I met Hettie Jones for the first time 10 years later in 1964 at 27 Cooper Square in New York City. She was little. I knew right away that I had nothing to fear or question in either of them. They were friends. Under that banner, they were protectors when I had need of same. Of equal importance, they were interpreters of the world we shared. They were there for me when I feared and questioned the physical and spiritual dimensions of that world's threats and wonders. Answers? Not always, but each of them freely gave comfort with thoughts different from my own and backed by long years of observation and reflection. Hettie and Charles, as writers, can share the comfort and excitement with strangers and friends further afield than New York and Gloucester. One thing those writers share was a friendship of long standing with my mother and teacher, Helene Doran. It makes all kinds of sense to me that we are meeting here today in celebration and memory of that. I'm delighted that this is happening, and thank Henry Farini and his colleagues at the Gloucester Writers Center and the Olson Society for inviting us all to be present. And my dear friends and co-workers at the Cape Ann Museum for donating the space we're sitting in. Hooray for us all. To make a long story short, and by all means, as per the last sentence of how I became Hettie Jones, please welcome Hettie Jones to where we live.
You know, I have to stand up high on something in order to be seen. I've been telling everyone this story that when I read at the New York Public Library, the video shows me with the microphone coming out of my nose. So I really didn't want to repeat that, especially since I'm here in this very, very, very special place to me. And I want to say thanks and echo all of Fred's thanks. And if I go through all the names again, surely we'll mess them up. So I'll just say thanks to Fred for preceding me with his ideas. And I want to thank you all for coming out in this. I can't even see the back of you. There are so many of you, so that's really wonderful. I also really and truly wanted to thank Fred's family, all those Bucks, for being, and I knew them before they were born, just for being so gracious, and especially to Ketty Buck McLean for picking me up at Route 128. I didn't even know you could get off the train at Route 128, and then driving me through the traffic on Route 128, which I did remember. Who else? I did want to thank Helene Doran, and there she is, even though I can't remember where the water is, where we are right now, but she's in the harbor right there. And despite being in the harbor, she still managed to gloriously provide my hotel room. So I want to thank her. I hope she's got a wicked grin on her face, or I know so, because we always worried about money, always. But it's Charles Olson himself that I must truly thank first. For without a certain moment of acknowledgement from him, I might never, ever have begun writing, publishing, or putting together the book we're celebrating today. So I want to begin by reading a little story I wrote about this moment that appears in my memoir, How I Became Hettie Jones, which I always say is a good way to get your name on the cover twice. But I wrote this story many years ago using both the third person to give myself distance and the first person to comment on the long ago event. He was such a tall man, the famous older poet, that there were parts of the kitchen where he couldn't stand straight. So she sat him down at the far end where he appeared sitting like any normal man, eating his breakfast eggs. There he is in the front, and behind him, there's Helene. To her, a mother still in her 20s, he was a man of whom she might have been in awe, but she wasn't, either because he put her at ease or because she was then more arrogant and self-assured than I remember. She was very small, as has been mentioned, and only came up to his waist. When they'd first met the previous evening, much was made of this distance. Then a child came running in, the younger one, just learning to talk and seeming incredibly small in the perspective lent by the tall man. She bent conscientiously to the child, explaining something, a lesson about responsibility, teaching that word is what I remember. The man ate, listening to her, though she wasn't aware of this, as there were other people in and out eating. It was after the child left that he complimented her. "I like the way you use language," he said. She felt humble, but warmed to him immediately, pleased that he liked what she hadn't yet proven, and no one had so quickly read her heart. His opinion of her gave her courage. She withheld nothing. They became friends, and it was the nature of the occasion that they should have, since the tall man and his wife and another good man and his good wife had come to spend a week. Luckily that week, because that week there was no money for food. And it was terrific that these guests had arrived and could buy food for everyone. And they could admire themselves for feeding 6 adults and 2 children on chicken backs and carrots for poetry and justice for all. She was having a great time. She cornered the older poet and pressed for his secrets. "What is your wife to you?" she demanded, then confided that she sometimes thought her husband didn't love her. But there he demurred, saying, "No, I have seen the two of you. I have seen you sleeping together." It was his gentle emphasis on the word sleeping that held her ear and therefore her imagination, and so holds me now. It was the note only that she heard there in the narrow hall, standing literally under his arm and him bending over as she had bent to the child. I can see now what she couldn't have known then, though she wanted to believe him. He was so much older and wiser than she, and she trusted him so. But she had only her young woman's point of view, and she was certain that a man, even he, couldn't know the whole of it. She nodded and leaned close to let him know she'd understood his lesson, what one word, one tone could mean. But she kept her face averted, hiding her refusal to accept his judgment, just that once. Later, he wrote her some funny, friendly letters that were mostly about business, poems of his, I think, which she kept for a long while and then sold to pay the rent. By that time, he was dead. She minded selling the letters, but didn't feel guilty. He would certainly have understood, she thought, living on chicken backs. Anyway, she chose to keep not what the man wrote her from his desk, but what she felt he had truly given her, what occurred between them, and I am left with her choices. And that was in my first memoir, How I Became Hettie Jones. But sometimes you don't know how far back those choices go, or what's going on subconsciously. I wrote that little story around 1985, but just recently discovered something that I think would have also pleased Charles. I've been writing about my childhood and how I began using my experiences to create a life that would be of my own making, not one imposed on me. Because very early on, I seemed to have a different perspective from everyone around me. Of course, we're all familiar with Olson's wonderful line, "I pose you your question, shall you uncover honey where maggots are? I hunt among stones." I've quoted it in this new book to describe how, as I set myself to write and publish seriously, it was with the goal of tackling subjects that I felt had been neglected. But it was only a few weeks ago, writing out some of my earliest memories, that I discovered I'd led myself, all by my own self, to what Charles instructs in his poem. This is titled 1937. Not yet old enough for the lake, the 3-year-olds are playing in the stream. It's rocky but not slimy or threatening. The water is cold. You squat in it, wet in a bathing suit. She has a toy in her hand that's not hers. It's a sieve with which he has dipped up pebbles from the stream bottom, and left in it, as the water cascades, is a spread of shining stones, each different in color and shape, each glittering so separately bright and wet in the sun. Beauty, she thinks, just that word. But before she can touch the stones, someone takes the sieve away, and they're gone. It never occurred to her to speak of what she had seen. Perception, a mystery, was nothing to reveal. But the word itself, beauty, now had a form. I just found that. I was so excited. I said, oh my goodness. In January 1969, my first visit to Gloucester, I'd arrived with my 2 daughters and 2 dogs in what you now call a vintage station wagon, but back then was only 10 years old. It was a Ford 59, if you know what those looked like. It had just finished snowing. Oh, we lost the snow. And it was even colder here than I'd expected, but there we were, all of us in one small motel room. I wish I could tell you exactly where it was, but I have no idea. I vaguely remember a hill, but that's all. I had driven up from New York, despite any anticipated weather, to check on Helene, who had just returned from Spain. By that time, she and I had been writing each other for a decade, having made instant connection that week when she and Ed and Charles and Betty had arrived in New York to buy us food. Thank goodness. And there we were. Since that first wintry trip in 1969, this is part of my new book, I've been to Gloucester in all weathers, visiting Helene wherever she landed in this fisherman's town. Much of Gloucester's history can be traced now as memorabilia collected by the Cape Ann Historical Association on platforms in the basement, and I beg your pardon, you renovated it, and now they're on the top. That's not my fault. On platforms in the association's museum are remarkably small boats that once saw service in the sea, their very size making the point that we have honed our appetites on the brains and brawn of amazingly brave men. And though there's little enough left of the fisheries that gave the town its character, Gloucester remains an active harbor. Long lines of craft form below the Western Avenue drawbridge. The air and the light, the summoning gulls, remain the same. And the boat, wrote Olson, how he swerves it to avoid the yelping rocks where the tidal river rushes. In 1960, when we began to write, Like most women then, Helene Doran and I were married with children. What set us apart were our men and our context. The beat, Black Mountain, San Francisco, New York, Bohemia of that time, the Kerouac, Ginsberg, O'Hara, de Kooning nexus that has had such a lasting impact on American culture, the place I call Boyland. Each of us had arrived with something in mind, she to make art, I to write, and then foundered on love, on the hardships and distractions of marriage and motherhood. Still, we were taking it all in, putting things by. And how we met seems a crucial part of our story. I'd come home from work to a party. In the group with my husband, Leroy Jones, was a man I didn't recognize, and surprise, a woman. In 1960, at 6 on a cold December evening, the women I knew were either home with their kids or warming up at the Cedar Bar. But here in my house was a tall, beautiful blonde who swooped down, relieved me of my bag of groceries, and with her free hand fingered the fabric of my coat, my outer garment, that is, a poncho I'd pieced together from multicolored woolen samples. "Did you make that?" she asked. Her husband, introduced as the poet Edward Dorn, pointed out that Helene, this woman, his wife, had made the finely tailored, lined silk jacket he was wearing. In 1960, few women managed to keep their own skills in sight, and so immediately presented the evidence. We left the men and went to the kitchen, ready to talk. Well, that was a really significant moment. You do get dry using your voice. You had to learn the trade-offs in Boyland. You had to will yourself part of art's transformative power, while most of its transformations left you the same. You had to be brave and resourceful, a little cunning. And it had to be worse where you'd come from. Helene had traded an early settled marriage for a vagabond life with Ed in the rural West. I discarded family for Leroy and the centrifuge of downtown Manhattan. There we all are. At dinner that night, we kept trying to keep our conversation going across a large, round, noisily occupied restaurant table. That's how it was to be with us. Words across distance, sometimes through difficult, even perilous times. I was planning to write, but had yet to figure out what or how. Meanwhile, I was 2 months pregnant, had a toddler and a day job, and a husband on his way to fame. I needed to hear from this straight-talking woman. Nothing fancy, just what she was thinking and doing. Like me, Helene had fled an intended life. She had 3 kids. She laughed out loud. Her favorite ending to any art-life dilemma was ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. The 7-year difference between us presaged a change in the kind of life a woman might choose, and the result of that choice on her later life. Helene, born 1927, entered our mutual Bohemia already a mother, a woman stifled in a traditional first marriage and freed by her second. I, born 1934, entered that same circle, married but determinedly independent, a college graduate already earning her own living. So we were 2 differing stories, but with one shared point of view. We'd fled the norm for women then, because to live it would have been a kind of death. every time I say that, people look at me and they say, whoa, do you really mean that? I really meant that, yes. It took 20 years and some persuasion before I agreed to write How I Became Hettie Jones, my memoir of that 60s Bohemia. I've been working on children's books and poetry and stories, as well as editing and teaching, and I couldn't see the purpose. I thought people just wanted gossip. Until finally, I began to see that particular story as a way to teach. Since then, given the book's success, but that it concerns only the 1950s and 60s, people, women especially, have been asking, when are you going to write Remaining Hettie Jones? Another 20 years has passed while I considered addressing this. Why continue the story? Of what use would it be? What attraction? Scholars have tended to heroicize beat chicks who lived through that scene and got out alive. But afterward, lacking the anchor of male celebrity, what did they do? Where did they go? What kept them alive? How did I remain Hettie Jones? In How I Became, I wrote that our letters kept me from sinking. Now they've kept time, the right time, because it's easy to be wrong. It was Helene who sent me, as I was writing that book, Kay Boyle's warning against memory's dreamy, evasive eyes. But here in these letters, eyes peeled, we look straight out from wherever we were. To correspond isn't to duplicate, but to harmonize. I looked that up. Yes, what was accomplished in all those years of words that crisscrossed the continent and sometimes the ocean? For us, a record of our separate evolutions, 2 takes on a possible woman's life. For the reader, a glimpse into that process. And what would this teach? Sometimes you have to let an idea reveal itself. I learned this from the men I knew. From Robert Creeley, that one thought should simply lead to another. From Jack Kerouac, that spontaneity can be achieved through writing in the moment what the mind has been putting by. From Leroy Jones and others, that content determines form. And from Charles Olson, specificity, as I wrote, what one word, one tone can mean. I can't emphasize enough how I value these lessons. What I didn't learn from the men, though, was to value my moments enough to speak of them. For that, I needed Helene, who similarly valued hers. When we met, she'd been married to Ed since the mid-50s, time enough to have figured out how to maintain her integrity, if not her art. The latter, like mine, a story waiting to be told. I learned a lot from her scholarly bent, her excellent eye, and I learned, as I groped toward myself, what it was to have a friend who would herself benefit from our exchange. Once we began writing, we never stopped, though sometimes there were silences or only postcards when work consumed us, as eventually we both became single mothers / working artists. Discarded wives, a definition Helene found. We got over the discards and into the scorecards. Sorry, that's a terrible one. But it was so apropos, sorry. Naturally, making up for lost time took new time. I was 37 when my first book was published. Helene, 44, at her first show. But we got there somehow or other. Offline, she wrote, after we'd progressed to email. I've been offline since the day I was born. But what, after all, is the subject of an offline life? As a poet, I take my thesis from one way to drive the poem, which is to approach its subject from multiple directions. Letters, too, come from every which way, including time. Does their aggregate make a subject? Not guaranteed. But like poems, they offer voices, as in, the authors have agreed to speak, and we, the future, have caught them unawares. Letters also offer arrivals, as in, at last they brought themselves to the table. Thus, this correspondence offers two voices, each of two women bringing herself to the table, approaching each other from different directions to the other's witness for 40-odd years. Oddities themselves, offline. I'll read from the letters now, but first, water. I've been telling everyone I'm not used to steam heat. It's warmer in Gloucester than my house in New York. Every chapter in Love H begins with an epigraph from a woman poet. Chapter 1 starts with some lines from a young woman named Aliyah Zaveri. A woman must be like water. Like water, you have to know where you're going before anyone else does. In times of hardship, in times of heat, you have to steam. Only then will you rise. Pocatello, Idaho, 1962. Dear Hettie, here's some Idaho juniper. I'd enclose a piece with those crazy blueberries, but that's really asking too much of the Pony Express. Still, I hope some of the perfume makes it here, from here to Manhattan. Thunder and Big Head, the hosses on this here ranch, are grazing on Jackie Kennedy's land just above us, getting fat and sleek on all those free government acres just beyond our landlord's fence. Hey, thanks again for your good letter. The strength you have at 28, I frankly need at 35. New York, 1962. Dear Helene, didn't mean to suddenly stop writing like a clock turned off. Working full-time today, so this is on 8th Street Bookshops time. Roy's play opens 2 weeks from tomorrow. Do you think I can make a dress in 2 weeks that will be fancy enough to make everyone think I'm the poet's inspiration and sexy enough to make them think I don't care? The following year, Leroy began the Black Arts movement that would draw him back to Newark, his hometown, and into his subsequent activist life as Amiri Baraka. I didn't try to stop him. One half makes you whole, he'd warned when our daughters were born, Kelly in 1959 and Lisa in 1961. That had always been clear. Whatever this made me had never been defined, but why, after all, should it have been? Nevertheless, in my few years of witness as the mother of Black children, I'd seen enough. Only to Helene had I confessed. I am too out of my brains to write. Sometimes I'm afraid to go to bed because I start to think. Pocatello, 1965. Shit, Hettie, we're so far away and I can't sit down and write my arms around you. But I mustn't mail this without telling you that the letter I started in ink on April 30th ended so abruptly because as I was sitting here deep in the clutches of trying to say something to you, the doorbell rang 1,000 times till I went to stop the sound, and there in the rainy spring morning stood two little women, thin bones, tight skin, powdered faces. They asked how I was, seeing as I was rather upset, and I answered, fine, but very busy. Oh, but we have only come to have a short talk about the second resurrection. I flipped. They were taken aback, obviously embarrassed or confused by the tears. Oh, I'm so sorry was all I could manage besides shutting the door. I wish I had the power to really tell you what it was like. Anyway, I walked from door to closet, got my coat, went out the back door, and walked around this godforsaken town for 3 hours. In 1965, the Dorans left for England, where Ed had a Fulbright appointment to the University of Essex. Colchester, England, 10/19/65. 65. Dearest Het, imagine buying a nice head of cauliflower and turning the corner to find yourself standing in front of the remains of a 12th century priory. Finally getting settled and learning the language, which takes learning. A paper cutter, my dear, is a guillotine. Dinner's ready, and I gotta go to a wives' meeting tonight, just to let you know we made it. Please write, I'm suddenly lonely. New York, Thursday, 4th November, 1965. Dearest Helene, was so glad to get your card and have been trying to write ever since, but tied up with proofreading, cold, school parent meets, etc. But I now have my very own room. No curtains as yet, so I'm available to all of 3rd Avenue. Still, it's very pleasant to have a place that's not the kitchen. Went to a party at Bob Thompson's 2 weeks ago and got propositioned 4 times. A newly available woman, you dig? I got bugged and I decided to screw someone, and it was all very swell, but the minute my mind started working again, like about 1 minute later, Roy's poem, I got nothing against you, baby, but I got to get back home. Great news, department, I have a dog named Ho Chi Minh. Marion Brown had promised the kids a dog for Christmas, but got this puppy from some girl in a bar on Avenue B. Part shepherd and the rest plain mongrel, incredibly smart, everybody's darling, but really my baby. Wednesday, November 17th. Please forgive me. So many days in trouble since I started this. It's hard to write such lousy longhand, and I can't keep up with my thoughts. Still no typewriter. I'm terribly, terribly lonely and can't figure out what to do with myself. Like I should go out when there's nothing to do here in the evening, but can't afford it. I will, of course, live as you know. 28th November, 1965, Colchester. And it has been cold. Hello, sweet Het. It was so great to get that long, long letter, but I wish so much you were happier, and I don't even damn well know what to say, except that you've got to stop walking from room to room sighing. Somehow or another, you've really got to, and you also got to stop hopping into bed as some sort of out. This is one of those stupid letters. It's now 1st December, and I have about 5 pages to type for Ed, plus a bunch of quotes to look up and copy. Oh, yes, it's 10-ish. The kids have hit the sack. Ed across the table from me working, Coltrane with red garland on the box, cars whizzing by outside on their way to London or Markstay or Cambridge or Tilbury Ferry. It's a really groovy, foggy night. I've invested in a couple of heavy wool knit dresses, heavy cotton socks, a bottle of scotch, and I don't care how cold it gets. England is beautiful. The people I can't stand one day and really dig the next. I've got to quit and get to work for Ed. Look, sweetie, we love you, which is damn little help, God knows, but I feel so helpless, especially with now the ocean between us. I can't even phone. Please know I think about you. Please, too, hold on somehow. New York, 11/28/65. Hold on to your hats. I'm going to be editor of Culture for a year, maybe more if it works out. Lita Hornick asked me first thing to do that anthology that Roy began collecting but left along with other things he no longer wanted. Also, whatever ban she had put on political things is off. So if you would like to write about England and politics and Rhodesia and South Africa, aside from this, I'm not fine, but it will help and give me something to care about. I think the first cover after the anthology should be Culture 21, Watch Out, because I don't see the sense in doing anything unless it stirs up turmoils. Do you? I hope I can do it. Colchester, 12/3. Groovy! Bless little old Lita's heart. Of course you can do it. And how great to get that mag back where it says something. Ed will write you later. I'm just sending this quickly to let you know how glad we are. Did I send a card the day Paul and I went to the Tower of London? I can't remember. He wore me out racing up and down those crazy stone stairs. I felt like I was in a Vincent Price flick. New York, 12/19. Lita Hornick rescinded her offer 3 days after she tendered it. But I am still to do a poetry anthology, though not till spring. What a drag, eh? For a few days, I felt like everything I get is always taken away 3 days later, or 8 years. I'm okay, cynical, but okay. Colchester, Sue, February 1966. Hello, dear Het. The clock in my room just chimed 10 and the sun came out at the same time. The gardener is working in Grandma Palmer's garden below us. He goes with the house, the contract says, and thinks I want to play Lady Chatterley with him because I'm all the time looking out the windows. It's a lovely landscape. I'm sure he thinks it's him I'm digging. Yup, he just came in. I was looking out the window of the kitchen sink when, blam, into my view comes his gray hair. Now he's on the other side raking or something. No, by God, he has one of those magnificent witch brooms, huge, and he's sweeping the grass with it. How about that? They sweep the grass in East Anglia. But enough of my affair. You'd think that very funny, could you see him? I wish I could write all kinds of soothing things. You are a Greek tragedy, and it's also miserably real, and it's horrible knowing there's nothing I can say, really. For God's sakes, write as often as you please. At least it's something I can do. Hold it, too. That always knocks me out. New York, Friday, March 4th, 66. Dearest Helene, hurrah, the typewriter is fixed, and I've just landed a job as an editor for university books. Unfortunately, an hour and a half from here by subway and bus. I go there 4 days and spend Friday at home reading. Spent this week working on copy for the Encyclopedia of Psychic Science, from which you can gather that they publish for what Joyce Johnson calls the nut market. But also the psychedelic review of Tim Leary and works by Gurdjieff. So it will be good. That is, I am going to make it good. The kids are okay, but they are both about to get the mumps because the small downstairs neighbor has it now. The washing machine died and needs $75 to come back to life. Have had to stop taking Enovid birth control because of dreadful fatness and exhaustion. It's good to be normal, and if I stand on my head every time I want to fuck instead of fucking, I'll be all right. Best news. Lita Hornick doesn't, after all, want me to do the anthology and sent me $100 for services rendered. I can only tell you that after all that work, I'm going to sell it again. I must get back to the life and times of seances and spiritualism. Did you ever see a verified photo of a medium with ectoplasm extruding from her nose, with pictures of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the ecto? My love to you all, to Jeremy Prynne for the nice little squiggle on your postcard arrived this morning, and to the English ghosts for their being worthy of the literature that's going to keep us in the green. On the back of the envelope containing this letter, Monday, couldn't mail, no stamp. Boss going to lend me dollars for car big as a house, drove it tonight. Lita H. is doing Antho again. Tell Ed send poems immediately. Crazy world, no? Colchester, March 66. Dearest Het, so very good to get your letter. The job sounds crazy. Come to me, my psychedelic bay, yay, 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 bee. New York, 3/11/66. Dearest Helene, I'm cooking a chicken, also at the same time finding you on the map. Jesus, those names. Wivenhoe, Shoeberryness, Clacton, Burnham-on-Crouch, Foulness Island. Foulness Island? Cardigan, Hereford, Gloucester? Everything from sweaters to cows to Shakespeare. What a language. Editing now a book written by a priest who ran away from his order because of his balls. I like my new job very much. I'm buying a station wagon, Ford 59, from the handsome garage man next door. If boss doesn't come through, I'll have to borrow. Anyway, with the help of God and influence, I'll be able to drive to work next week. I'm facing 7 pairs of little girl tights, all with holes in the knees or the toes or the asses, and a box labeled clearly K Anthology, and a box full of other mending, and the book I am working on at my job called The Circle of Sex, more of this later, which I was supposed to be working on all day today instead of dragging laundry, all of it unfinished business of a sort, hanging like a number of stones, always on my conscience, ding dong bell, pussies in the well. In later years, I taught in a number of different prisons, and when I got there, I learned a lot. Prisoner advice. Don't serve the time, let the time serve you. In this instance, the time had a place, as I would write, in the middle of other people's wars, and a perfect irony in that this territory is called no man's land. The 60s swirled with division, not all of it good, imperialism's retreat in Africa versus the closing of universities in China, for one big example. I watched all but connected to none, reduced, it seemed, to what I alone could make of myself. Around me, women seemed to be rising from a long sleep, though it wasn't easy to stay awake, I knew, in the face of the real deal, not the romance. Nevertheless, I'd just written a poem, the first since my divorce. It's got long lines and needs a lot of breath to recite, and over many years, I've given it all I've got in honor of all that. It also needs a lot of water. Paleface. I am driving down the Connecticut Turnpike in a 13-year-old car whose name is Geronimo. An Apache chief born 1829, died 1909, 44 years before the start of the car, which goes valiantly down the Connecticut Turnpike, land of the Pequot, not the Apache, but stalwart and brave, as the children in the back seat are stalwart and brave and young. Their eyes are black, their eyes are beautiful, their eyes are glittering with the anger of at least 4 traceable generations, and they will not allow it to happen to anybody else. Oh, my children are so beautiful and stern on the Connecticut Turnpike. They have caught my heart in a net of silk strings that swings and bangs in the center of my body, even as they did once, and the heat of it, my heart swinging at 60 miles an hour. Geronimo, Geronimo, take me home and contain me, or let me flourish in the eyes of my children. Let the speed go out of me into their soft arms. Let me rest. I am tired of the Connecticut Turnpike, of Indians who fought so valiantly but did not win. Let it be quiet. It's too hard to get anything done with all this swinging and banging. Geronimo, the Apache, the eyes of my children. There's no end but surrender, and I cannot surrender. It's not right to die on any man's reservation. Oh, chief of the Chiricahua, terror of Arizona, 1882, on the Connecticut Turnpike in the land of the Pequot, 1966. In 1969, with her daughter Shan and younger son Paul, Helene returned to the States and settled in Gloucester. One early letter mentioned a small drafting table. So tired, she wrote, but alive nonetheless, and anxious, believe it or not, to get something going on that drafting table. In How I Became, I wrote of a faith between us. We knew that what was incomplete still compelled us and hid the same shame at having abandoned it. Now there was no time to lose. Helene's first show in 1971 was a one-person exhibit of mosaics created from glass and metal washed up on the harbor beaches. In her artist statement, she mentions discards that left to lie often become extremely beautiful. Today, decades later, I'd like to linger over her long-ago word choice, for without discards, we'd have none of the value and challenge of found objects. I almost want to say that as discards ourselves, we found in art a way to turn one into the other. Aren't they cute, huh? That's called superheroes, by the way. My first book appeared in 1971, the same year as Helene's first show. I was 37, she 44. "This town is so beautiful," she wrote in March. "I wish you would come now while we've got lamb weather and before they blast us all because the CIA dropped a bomb in a White House John." I didn't make it up there then, though I would, often, over time. But two phrases from her artist statement seem to describe, in 1971, the lives we were going for: the end of pattern and beginning of sculpture, and found objects, some tampered with, some not. We would go on to write for the next 30-plus years, and I marked our recovery from that earlier life with a poem that I wrote for her called "A Little Light Verse for Helene." This was the first verse about us. Heartbreak, hardship, humiliation crossed the nation. And this was the worst verse about us, in the teeth of it, gritting ours, the bite it took, the meat from our bones, poems. But the last and best is a little light verse about us. The sea light around us, the light your glass pictures soak, spill as we make light of it. Glaze that core with a bright shine, become a pearl of a girl. Yeah, mama, the way your glass holds light, we take hold, take the light, heart. Let's see what comes up. We told stories, offered reading advice, foods to cook. Here's one from Helene, dated February 15th, 1994. Backside of this paper is a copy of Gloucester Daily Times article with recipe 9 raisins soaked in gin. Remedy for arthritis that I couldn't resist trying because I had this big bottle of gin left over from 2 years ago when Steph's mother was visiting. But then it got too much, trying to gauge when to eat the raisins so the alcohol wasn't depleting everything else my body needed to survive. I think the ladies who could move better were probably just tipsy. I got no argument with that. And the raisins are very tasty. If I'd had my head about me, which I very much don't seem to have these days, I'd have described the section of the AIDS quilt I put stitches on. Sometime I'll tell you all about that, the stitches, the waiting in line, the ceremony. 3 images were all she needed. I took such pleasure in this writing, in the act itself, and her choice to perform it. I replied from Laramie, Wyoming, where I was then teaching, on a postcard featuring a photo of Grace Raymond Hebard, University of Wyoming professor of political economy, standing on a covered wagon circa 1920. "Only you deserve this great woman," I wrote. "Dig those sexy boots and that skirt. And is that her dishpan? Why, yes." In 1989, a friend offered me $50 to take over her class at Sing Sing Prison. Of course, after a few weeks, the money dried up. But in calling around for funds, I managed to get a class in Bedford Hills, the maximum security prison for women in New York, an easy drive for me, and where I taught for 12 years. Helene, who was making masks then, was my scholar and research assistant, suggesting writers and materials, and I've always wished I could have brought her up there. The next poem is about that experience, but I think its central theme applies just as well to the two of us. It's called Mother Moon. Mother Moon surfs the sky, rides the white-capped clouds. Mother Moon is a visitor over the Bedford Hills Penitentiary, climbing the barbed wire, the old brick, the young woman wondering whether she'll bleed to death. Mother Moon is like me. She knows when to say correctional facility. Mother Moon over the parking lot, diving into the potholes on the highway. Mother Moon is bringing in the harvest. You know she grows cocaine. Mother Moon, she's bad sometimes. She's big. She turns the tide, and every double X chromosome. Blood is only one part. We are way past what they say defines us. We renew. Mother Moon rides high. We too, we change. Thank you. Well, after one more drink of water and one more poem, isn't it wonderful that God invented water? I'm really going to close with a last poem for you, my dear audience, for sitting so attentively in the darkness back there. It's called All Told and was written as memorial to the poet Kenneth Koch, who devised a form that consisted of disparate topics grouped together, which, come to think of it, is what a correspondence does too. All told, to October 13th, New York, humor, plants, legs, motherhood, and destiny. It's warm in New York, my favorite place, and everyone is hanging out in shirt sleeves or sleeveless, not like that long ago October day when it was cold enough for the woolen suit I wore to my first and only wedding. How lucky I am to have my good humor. Without it, I might have been blue instead of delighted enough with my life and the two baby houseplants I've just brought home to share with me their destiny, or maybe to combine us in that one big destiny. But oh, I've forgotten my legs. How could I leave them out of such an important poem? And maybe they deserve one of their own for holding me up all this time through joy and pain, strong enough to push me through the streets while my lazy ass sits on its bike seat. Oh, New York, it's Friday the 13th, and I haven't even mentioned motherhood, but that's another whole story. And all told, I'm just as happy to end here, wherever that is, with my plants and legs and humor and all of you and yours out there in that destiny we share. Thank you very much.